I think the conversation led to us talking about our shared kind of colonial past and how it can come up and how, what is it to heal it, what is it to transcend it. Some of that conversation came up, and then we said, let's start talking or exploring some of these themes together as in pairs, like as partners. I think that's what I remember, Steve. Is anything else you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think I think that's absolutely right, and I think I was very struck by your comment, which was actually more directed, I think, in terms of India, but is equally relevant here, which has to do with what is our relationship to the past, you know. So that's kind of relates a little bit to this issue.
Yeah.
And I feel really good about this conversation because, you know, for Mary and I, you know, we have two lives. One is in the West and one is in India. And they, you know, so there's something really feels so good about being able to have this conversation, you know, because both of these places are, for both Mary and I, they're very, I mean, especially for me, because I'm British and she's Australian, but both these places are very, very deep in my sort of heart, if you like, and my psyche and everything, and have, you know, so that I've thought about these questions about colonialism and also, you know, Britain's relationship to India and my relationship to India and you know, so much. I mean, it's kind of a major stream of thought in my life.
Yeah, before we go any further, because I don't know Suruchi at all, and Abhi, we haven't spoken that much. You know, we had that conversation on flat, but just to fill out, because I think you, Steve, as he said, but I feel like my coming of age was in India, because I studied really South Asian philosophy and language when I went to college. And then I went to India and I basically didn't leave for 7 years. My child was born in India. And I figured close to a third of my life probably in India. So it's been very formative in as a kind of, as a person, as an adult, and yeah, very much so. So, you know, Steve and I, we share that. It's not just somewhere I've visited, but I feel in a certain way, I've often felt more at home at a deeper level. It's not like I think I'm Indian or I whatever, but it's like this sense of being at home in a way that's always been there. So it's been a very interesting reference point then to explore, as Steve was just saying, a lot of the, you know, our intertwined history, and to look at, well, okay, you know, how does that all work, right? Because although I was born in Australia, I'm Australian, but my parents are British, very British. So I've got a lot of history there too. So anyway, that's just to say a little bit. Oh,
You want to go?
You go ahead, then I'll share.
So I'm an actress. I do mainly theatre and some amounts of television and advertising. I also am a facilitator using my theatre training to do workshops for corporates and NGOs. I did my college in the US, but somehow I didn't want to follow the typical Indian dream of settling in the West. I don't know. There was something in my heart which was very sad when I was in the US. So within like a month of me finishing my degree, I came back to India, and I've been here ever since then. And I met Abhishek 12 years ago, and he's quite a madman. And I'm here with him for the ride, you know, and it's been amazing. Yeah.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah, I can also share. I think my childhood has been in urban India, and it has coincided with India's liberalization. I was 10 years when the economy opened up. So throughout my teenage, we've gone there. My family has been a big beneficiary of that journey also, and always felt very attached to India. I would say I had my summer internships in Singapore as an investment banker, and I traveled Europe as an exchange student, but felt called to India. Uh, and at the same time, I feel that this conversation is interesting because it just feels like you seem to be like the easternmost point of West. Like you come from the West and you're fairly East. And in some ways, we are the westernmost point of East in many ways, because we are highly. One is obviously the education system itself is a Western education system we have had, but also we're fairly individuated, and I would place ourselves as very different from our culture. In some ways, we are not even representative Indians in terms of how we've stood up vis-a-vis our families, the choices we have made, and we kind of I in fact identify many times with being a world citizen, and there are things that I find my global friends understanding and perceiving much more quickly than back in India. So I definitely find resonance there. And yet I would say we're Indian at heart in some ways. Sur also loves India with all its things and everything, with all its chaos and messes. And so do I. So yeah, so it's interesting to me. This conversation is also, we're both kind of, I see these cultures stretching in a way that we can meet. And it's interesting that it's happening between us who both have this blend of opposites. uh, yeah, so I would say that yeah, we're not typical Indians for sure. In one way, everybody is an Indian. Like, how can you say there's a typical Indian? Is there anything like a typical anything? But just to say that yeah, we have that edge, the Western edge also.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Mm.
Um, I Yes, I mean, I'm just to say, I mean, I come from an extremely British background, and in a way, my family sort of is sort of you know. I mean, I haven't looked at my family tree in this regard, but you know, I don't know how much my family was necessarily involved in India, but um, you know, I um, you know, I was kind of very aware of being British when I was in India, especially actually more and more so at a certain point. Um, and being aware that, you know, I was the kind of person that would have been sort of sent out in the colonial era to, you know, to India. So that on one hand, you know, I come from this very sort of deeply British background. And at the same time, you know, I feel like I've got this very, you know, this sort of soul connection to India, which I don't really have to my own country, to be honest. In terms of my sort of soul, I feel actually like when I'm in India, I feel like I'm really myself in a way that is hard to explain. I mean, in a certain way, but it's the case. But there was a certain point when I had spent about 6 years in India on my own, which was back in the early 2000s, or sort of mid 2000s, and um, you know, I kind of wanted to understand more the experience of Indians of colonialism, you know, because being British, you know, but also I met certain connections in India, friends who, I mean, one particular conversation I had um, with somebody who's sort of older. He's not part of your generation. He's older, but he has a very deep affinity with India, and also with what's happened to India as a result of the colonial era. And when I first met him, he said to me, he said to me, "You have no idea how violent the occupation of India, you know, the occupation of India by the British was." And he was like very, I mean, I always find it quite difficult to get Indians to tell me what they really thought about it. You know, a lot of Indians would either like, you know, feel very positive about it and think it was all great and, you know, like it was fantastic, or else they would not talk about it, you know, to somebody British. So, so for me, uh, yeah, one of the things that was, what was very powerful for me was listening to this friend of mine be very straight about it. I mean, he just kind of just told it as it was in his experience. And that had a deep impact on me, actually, you know, as a British person. So it led to a lot of reflection about my own country, which is still going on very much, particularly because you know, we live in a culture now that doesn't really relate to the past. You know, I mean, it's like everything's in the present in the world, and it's in the sort of global world we live in now. Nobody really thinks about the past or thinks it's that relevant. That's something that I feel, and I just feel that the past is so important because it holds so much about who we are and how we relate to the world and what's happening in the world.
You know, when Abhishek asked me to be part of this conversation, and this afternoon I was thinking about it. It's interesting what Steve said, because I was just trying to think of ways that I could be polite.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, it's like I was trying to temper my responses and edit them, and I was like, what will I say? How will I say it? So it was so connected to what Steve said, you know. And then another thing which I feel sort of confident about is that, I mean, everything's cyclical, you know, somehow. And I feel the future belongs to brown people or black people, you know. And
It is, sorry, the future what belongs to, did you say? Yeah, yeah.
so I don't know what it is, you know, because maybe in the ancients, there was these great thriving cultures here, and people and civilization. And now for quite a while, it's been West is really ruling, and everything's very deeply influenced by the West. Like maybe of course, earlier on, there wasn't so much cross-pollination, so maybe one culture couldn't dominate the world. But again, in the future, it's going to shift, I think, and maybe become more intermingled, though. Like, it's not like one culture, but somehow it's just brown and it's black. You know, the future, something like that. Something like that.
I like the sound of that.
For me, there is an emergence of a world culture, I feel, a small, thin fabric of human beings, I feel, that form a connecting tissue around the world, who I've thought a lot about that. What would it be to be that kind of a person? And for a while, I felt it was to be a global citizen with a very fluid identity. Only in the last 5 years or so, or 5, 10 years, I'm realizing that it also involves being deeply rooted in my culture and then being a world citizen, because otherwise I wouldn't truly be a world citizen if I'm not truly rooted in my culture. And the two can and in fact need to coexist, which is like the dichotomy. So I feel there is an emergence of the world citizen or world citizenship, which is agile across cultures and which is connecting to a very evolutionary instinct. And I feel the place where we are coming from for this conversation is not only Indian and British, but also as world citizens who are actually forging something new, right? We're finding a common ground across cultures. And to me, that common ground is a world citizen ground. And I feel like the world doesn't need too many world citizens. I think like 2-3% is enough for a tipping point. Don't everybody doesn't need to be a world citizen. Everybody, people can be ethnocentric. People can be very patriotic and nationalistic. Everybody doesn't need to be that. I feel those of us who are called to do that, a very small percentage, is enough for now. I feel to hold a certain consciousness.
No, it's fascinating what you just said, Abhi, because I wanted to pick up. There's still been a lot of threads in this conversation already, but something that you said too, Suruchi, was when you said that the future is going to be black or brown. You know, I know a lot of people say that, and it's interesting because I, you know, without sort of putting it, you know, I actually think it's true. And the reason I think it's true, but I think it's going to be true in at this global level. It's not going to be just that you go and get an inversion you know, of a power inversion. I don't think it's going to be like that because of this, what we're saying about the 2 or 3 or 4% or whatever of a global, that I think is going to be very important. So we don't just reverse things.
Yeah.
But I do think you're right, because I feel like even in the West, there's a sensibility, people don't necessarily verbalize in this way, that the systems and thinking and sensibility of being Western or Eurocentric or Western centric is coming to its end. It's declining, right? Because its limitations have really, you know, are now being felt by even people who are really big advocates of it, you know, and this, what you were speaking about, you know, the top down, the fundamentally separated, objective, subjective, slice and dice, compartmentalized kind of worldview and relationship to life, right, is actually has coming to its, you know, its demise. It's actually, some of that brought a lot, but it's also obviously got big consequences. I feel in India, and the thing that I hugely appreciate is a kind of, is the dharmic depth, in a way, the depth that can hold complexity genuinely, but from a place that's really deep, which means it's non-ideological in a way. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of fluidity and context in that. So that's very different. I think in the West, it's very hard for us to be truly contextual in that fluid way. I do feel that the profundity of dharmic thinking is got something to offer the world that's really needed. Right? Yeah, going forward.
I mean, I was just wondering about your guys, you know, Abby, when you were talking about the integral conference, for example, and I was thinking, okay, so on one level you were saying, well, yeah, you know, you're kind of like, you're able to, you know, in a way, kind of relate to all these different kind of conceptions or ideologies that are global in a certain way. But what I'm wondering about is that those Europeans, right, on the conference, are they able to connect to something other than, you know, I mean, I get the integral thing, but the integral thing is a Western creation, right? It's got nothing to do with India. So what I'm wondering is, are those folks able or even interested in actually attempting to connect with the dimension of an entirely different form of thinking, which comes from your culture, you know? Because, you know, I mean, this is you know, as far as us having a, you know, Suruchi, what you were saying about, you know, like a black and brown future, I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, if that is actually going to happen, you know, part of it is going to need to be a certain kind of humility, sort of revelation of humility in the West, that we actually don't have all the answers, you know, because, you know, that hasn't happened yet, as far as I can see. I don't see that we in the West have got to a point where we really have taken in that we don't have all the answers, you know. I mean, even the integral thing is like, you know, we globalize everything. That's part of what we do in the West, right? We globalize everything, we make everything global. So integral's now global. It means everything for everybody, right? That's what we do, you know, right?
I think one thing that was evoked for me was that the Indian culture has been predominantly a culture of abundance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like I don't know if I should be proud of being in India, because it's not like I chose to be born here. It just so happened. And equally, I don't know if there is so much necessarily pride in feeling special about a culture, except that geographically it so happened to be in a very rich and gifted area with crisscrossing rivers and a climate that would allow human populations to thrive without having to fight for things. And so long periods of peace, long periods of contemplation, long opportunities to reflect on some of these questions.
Right.
And so dharma is also coming from a culture of abundance. And that's why it's evolved in a certain way. And I feel that the Western culture has its roots in lack and scarcity in some ways for purely geographical reasons of extreme climates and temperature. And uh, and what has happened now in the world is I feel we have reached a level of abundance but acting out of scarcity, because the cultural operating system is still a scarcity operating system. Maybe it was necessary to get us to a global abundance. Now I feel in some ways the redistribution may not be there, but in some ways I feel we're behaving still from a very a different operating system. I think something there for me was getting a go. The third passing thread that at some stage we should definitely speak about is Gandhi, right? Gandhiji, I feel Gandhiji's response to the British rule is innately the place where he's coming from, saying, you and I are not different, we are one. So I'm not going to hurt and harm you. I'm going to approach from non-violence and love for you while disagreeing with what you're doing. And it's a very, in some ways, it's a very Indian response to a Western oppression. And that's a very important piece to unpack, I feel. There is definitely something there. And that's where East meets West in some ways at a point of conflict as well. For East to say that, no, we're not abandoning our uh, cultural tradition in some ways. I think there's something there. Not a sweeping generalization. India has been a violent culture and colonized also, and still occupies places where they don't want to be part of the union. And also, I'm not claiming that high ground. I'm just saying zooming into that may reveal something. Yeah, these are some thoughts that were. That was the dharmic piece. That dharma, in fact, is also the dharma itself can't exist in scarcity, because in scarcity it's survival of the fittest. The question of dharma and to contemplate on dharma itself in some ways requires a certain extended space of peace and abundance to actually reflect on, can I act in ways that enliven me, the other person, the context. So I feel it's a product of the geography and the culture and the people who were there.
But something Abhi and I, we talk about a lot is, like what happened that India got colonized so many times over, first by the Mughals and then by the British. So what was it? What happened? What happened exactly there? Because it had been having such a good time for so long. That is why these amazing texts and the culture, the sculpture, literature that came out of here. But then I don't know. I don't know how. Like what we talk about that a lot.
What are your ideas about that? I mean, just what have you come to so far?
I have some, but yeah, so do you want to share? No, I think a culture.
Sorry, we're just eating a little bit. Our daughter got us a little snack. I'm so sorry. You just
It's okay.
What's other time?
Yeah. I feel a culture of abundance doesn't know to fight as fiercely as a culture of scarcity, for one. When you're coming from the desert, the earlier invasions were not the British, they were the desert people coming way more fiercely. And also there was a cultural misunderstanding in the sense, in India, from what I gather, kings would fight once, and once the fight is settled, it's settled. Like, you don't keep on fighting. But when Muhammad Ghazni came, he came like 17 times and kept on attacking, and that's kind of like, okay, that's not how we do this kind of a thing. And with Europe, I feel the progress became very fast because all these countries were similar sized and next to each other and in a kind of a race. And I feel that didn't happen in India, where kingdoms were sort of not like competing with each other in an aggressive way. But really, I think some of those are my thoughts of what must have happened.
Yeah.
Do you mind just going back to this question that I was asking before about your experience in interacting with these conferences in the West? I mean, I'm just curious, like, to what's your experience of, because like obviously I can see all the interaction can happen in this sort of global context, right? Because that's very natural. Everybody's sort of in that to an extent, right? But do you feel that there's an interest in actually your own kind of cultural experience?
Yeah. No, I can go a little into that. I wouldn't say there is deep interest. Maybe there is a passing curiosity. but even in terms of understanding, I feel they want to understand in their terms, not step out
Right.
of their cultural frames to come into our world and then look at it. So
Right.
that's challenging. And yet I feel that if like a east and west confluence has to happen, then someone like me, and I feel my culture is agile enough to go in and hopefully populate
Mm.
that world also, and kind of still bring
Mm.
some of this energy. I feel like it's my, I should, because where else? Like, I don't expect the other way to happen. Somehow, I don't know if the other thing will happen.
Because in a way I'm thinking, well, what is that? I mean, on one hand, it seems to me that it's very much an expression of the fact that we have been the dominant culture for a very long time, and even when we, yeah, and also it sort of relates to what you guys were saying about scarcity too. It's kind of like, but particularly this thing of having basically been the unquestioned kind of dominant force. It is, I think, very related to that, and that's why I'm thinking, just coming back to what Suruchi was saying about the black and brown future. I mean, I think that would be incredible if it happened. I think it's so important, but I'm just wondering, how are the steps towards that? We seem in a certain way so far away from it. I mean,
Sure.
to consider that a culture like India has something that we might need right now, I mean, and not just India, but we're talking about India right now, but I think India in a big way. How much do we, even the West, have any idea about, the kind of the depth and
Yes.
how many centuries some of these deep questions have been contemplated and considered in a country like India,
Mm.
When you saying like, is the West really interested and why would they not? It suddenly hit me. I was like, yeah, maybe they're not, because I never even thought about like what white people think, or people from other countries. So that was it kind of jolted me a little bit. But I think in my head it was all very like the numbers. If nothing happens, it's just the sheer numbers, and where brown people, black people, Asian people go, they take their culture with them.
Mm.
So, for example, more and more science, like doctors or labs, everything, and Silicon Valley and thing, you just roam around there and you just see Indians and Chinese everywhere. And what happens is that, not in an overt way, but wherever they are, they're going to bring their culture with them. And things are going to change because of that. I mean, they may have been even born and brought up there, but there are also a lot of newer immigrants, and also the older immigrants still carry strong traces of their culture, because families and things like that. So things are just bound to change. There's no way. I mean, when I was studying in the US, and now when I visit a lot, because my whole family moved to the US and they live there. So it's fascinating because I come and go a lot, I travel a lot, and I've just seen a change in the US. So I don't know about the UK, but in the US, it's been incredible, the change, from my nephews in their classrooms, the kind of diversity they have, to the things they talk about. All their teachers have become Indians, the kind of festivals they celebrate, even the white people. And
London is an incredibly multicultural, incredibly, far more than anywhere. And I've lived in the States too for about 20 years. So it's far more, and there's a lot less tension here, actually. You're just going to train, there's everybody, but it's still a city where white thinking, white systems, and mostly male, I have to say, are dominant. The dominant thinking is that. And I do see that the quote cosmopolitan element is there. I mean, food is amazing. You can get everything in London, and people, and like I said, people kind of mix and da-da-da-da. But in terms of the depth of cultural integration, I don't see that yet. I see that people want to aspire to that. And a lot of the Indians I meet have picked up not all of them for sure. And there's a lot of, it's usually the younger ones who, well, that I've noticed are starting to question, well, how can I be, even we've got this young person who's a lawyer, who's come, she's from Delhi actually, who's here. And, you can tell she's bringing her in the depth of her Indian sensibilities to that thing, but a lot don't. They just, so that's one question. But the other one is I want to pick up one Steve said, because I'm part of a, which I appreciate, kind of a kind of thin, I don't think you call it a thin layer, of Western culture that recognizes things need to change. We need to genuinely integrate and open more, and is looking for that. But at the same time, I feel there is a hubris still there. And I think the integral, as much as I appreciate Ken Morgan's thinking, I really feel that there. It just encompasses everything. And most do. And that's why I said the idea of even diversification is often quite superficial. It's just getting, it's not really an opening. And I think part of that, I don't know, but I'm thinking more about the Western side of this is, I think this thing of humility that Steve was doing, there has to be a point where we realize, whoa, we actually don't have all the answers. And the reason things are going awry is because we don't have all the answers. We had some good ones, right? Some good things have happened, but fundamentally, there is something that's missing, I think, in our cultural zeitgeist and our being, our civilizational being, that, and it's not to go bad, it's not that simplistic, but it's to open up and actually see, whoa, there are other cultures, other civilizational cultures that have a lot more understanding of things than we have, and I think that kind of, there's got to be something happening as well on that level, and part of it is I think understanding our history too, how brutal it's been. Why is the West got that quote, why is it dominant? It's because, largely related, I think what you said actually, Abhi, about the scarcity, it just went out and took everything it didn't have, right? And that,
right on.
Yeah, that mindset is still a bit there. We're still taking stuff from the global South. And, so I feel there has to be a break in that somehow, a kind of recognition of, there's a lot more to this for the West.
I totally agree with that. I'm right on board with that. Check it out. Like I just read yesterday in the newspaper that all our recycling here, we send to Turkey, right? Yeah. And basically, we don't recycle it here. It's sent to Turkey and it's just sitting in fields in Turkey, right? Dumped there, basically. It's not been recycled. It's just sitting in fields in Turkey, and that's it. Is the government here care about it at all? No, because we've been doing this kind of stuff for centuries, and it's appalling. To be honest, I feel very emotional about this particular topic, not about the recycling, but about our ability to be completely, have this amnesia about our history, and everything that people are taught in this country at school about history is all about the British kings and queens, and how, etc. The empire isn't even talked about in school. It isn't taught to students in school, right? So, this is the scale of ignorance there is about history, about the impact we've had on the world, the kind of violence, the kind of, which, like Mary said, I think it's totally to do with that scarcity. That's no doubt part of it. Gandhi said that the British were a race of shopkeepers, who basically just, it's just thinking about what we don't have and what we can get from other places. That's the kind of level we're talking about. So to me, it's like, I just feel like it's a shocking picture. Actually, it's an appalling picture, and I think for us in the West, that's no humility is going to come out of anywhere until we start to actually recognize some of those things. So, I mean, it's absolutely appalling. I mean, it really is. The history speaks for itself.
Mm.
I mean, that's why when this fellow said to me, this friend of mine in India said to me, you have no idea how violent the British occupation of India was. That's why it had an impact on me, because I just kind of like, it was the first time I really took that in, you know, and it was a very important moment for me, because I just realized, you know, this is like a scandal, you know, it's a scandal that you know, that this is not being spoken about in my own country and addressed, and people, young kids are not being educated about it, you know, because as long as they're not educated about it and they're brought up with this idea that somehow, you know, none of that really has any significance or is even known about, then where is any humility going to come from, you know?
And I think with that humility, it's more like also, I think, being genuinely open, right? Because narrative is very important. And if you, I do think that, yeah, anyway, curious what you guys think, because obviously it's a very emotional topic. And we've, because I think it was a real wake up too for us to see how deeply our culture and us were kind of blind to that. You know, you learn little bits and pieces, but it made sense to me quite profoundly. And I have to say, I feel like it's my dharmic training in India that allows me to even look at that without just rejecting, you know, because nothing's black and white, but without totally rejecting my own country or reducing it to another kind of binary that's not helpful. But I do feel that understanding the truth of our, you know, is just important, you know, because we've got these interwoven histories that are playing out in the world today. And I do think it's I want to go back to, I feel that it's that place of being able to hold everything without ameliorating it or mushing it together or just holding it. That's very, very important, you know. You guys okay?
So it is a very sensitive topic. We're going into territories which I don't know if people have even walked ever. I mean, where people from India and Britain have sat down and had these conversations. I do feel we're traversing uncharted territory, new territory.
Mm.
It can go slow, I think. Russian.
Yeah, it's a very delicate. I appreciate that. You know, it's a kind, because I was thinking a little bit about Gandhi. Well, I was just thinking about the profundity that he was right at the heart of this, because I think he understood this very, very deeply. And clearly, you know, and I think that just because it's a very raw subject that is actually still very alive, I feel. And I felt Gandhi at the heart of it, and his, as you were saying before, his understanding of nonviolence, the dharmic point of non-separation, really, and yet completely calling things out for what they were is very rare. You know, it's usually devolves, as we all know, into, you know, a separate defensive or an offensive positions usually. So that's, I think, very important part of this conversation. But I'm also curious what you guys. Just to say one little thing, I feel it's so much part of this thing of what's it mean to be global, really, to be truly global, you know, where there's a real, as you, I think in the very beginning, one of you said, where you're standing in your own, but you're also, there's an integration happening and an enrichment happening, but it's, you're also rooted in your own. And I think what Steve and I are pointing at, that's our experience anyways, that's very difficult in the West, because there's such a thing of us and everyone else can come into us. That's integration. And I know it just doesn't ring true to me. Or right, actually.
Share where you are, sir.
No, it's just I've had to work through years of just, I've had to work through years of grief, my heart being broken, and so much bile, you know, about this, and having to let it go. The sheer, what's happened to my dear country. So it's hard. And also, what is it? What is it? I hate painting anyone with the same brush. So when I say Westerners, I don't. You know what I mean? It makes them. What makes someone so arrogant? How can someone just, a whole race be so arrogant? I don't know. And so presumptuous. And I always ask Abhi, and I think, I'm like, did they must have really in their hearts believed that we were not human, or that we were uncultured, or, you know, we talk a lot, you know, over the years, that they thought that that they could treat others like that, you know, whether they were black people or, I mean, I know a few Indian kings went and captured a few places in the east, but those were just as territories and kingdoms. People were not treated like that, I think, you know. I don't think that happened. So what 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 is it? I don't know. So something I'm always left with no answers.